There has been a 1400% increase in the amount of deepfakes we've seen this year in the first 6 months compared to all of last year.
So my dad jumps on the line and he's like, I just talked to you, you were in prison and I'm leaving to go bring $10,000 of bail money to you. I'm like, what are you talking about?
At the end of last year, there were 120 tools with which you can clone someone's voice. And by March of this year, it's become 350. Being able to identify what is real is going to become really important, especially because now you can do all of these things at scale. We've been doing deepfake detection for now 7 years. Even before that, you have people manipulating audio and people manipulating video. And you saw that Nancy Pelosi slurring in her speech.
It's in the Rose Garden with all this sort of visual.
All they did was slow down the audio. And, it wasn't a deep fake, it was actually a cheap fake, right? And so what changed is the ability to use what are known as generative adversarial networks to constantly improve things like voice cloning or video cloning, or essentially try to get the likeness of a person really close. So it's essentially two systems competing against each other. And the objective function is, I'm going to get really close to Martine's voice and Martine's face. And then the other system is trying to figure out, okay, what are the anomalies? How do I, can I still detect that it's a machine as opposed to a human? So it's almost like a reverse Turing test. And so what ended up happening is, once you start creating these GANs, which are used in a lot of these spaces, when you run them across multiple iterations, the system becomes really, really good because you train a deep learning neural network. And that's where the deep fake comes from. And they became so good that lots of people have extreme difficulty differentiating between what is human and what is machine.
Deep fakes are more talked about now than they were in the past, right?
Yeah.
And so clearly this seems to have coincided with the generative AI wave, right? And so do you think it's fair to say that there's a new type of deep fake that is drafted on the generative AI wave?
Yeah, generative AI has allowed for combinations of wonderful things. But when we started, there was just one tool that, could clone your voice, right? Like, it was called Lyrebird, incredible tool. Was used for lots of great applications. At the end of last year, there were 120 tools with which you can clone someone's voice. And by March of this year, it's become 350. And there's a lot of open source tools that you can use to essentially mimic someone's voice or to mimic someone's likeness. And that's the ease with which this has happened. Essentially, the cost of doing this has become close to zero, because all it requires for me to clone your voice, Martine, now requires about 3 to 5 seconds of your audio. And if I want a really high quality deep fake, it requires about 15 seconds of audio. Compare this to before the generative AI boom, where John Legend wanted to become the voice of Google Home. And he spent close to 20 hours recording him saying a whole bunch of things so that Google Home could say, in San Francisco, the weather is 37 degrees or whatever, right? So the fact is that he had to go into a studio, spend 20 odd hours recording his voice in order for you to do that, compared to 15 seconds and 300 different tools available to do it.
I don't know if you remember this, Vijay, but this wasn't too long ago when I was in Japan, and I got this call from my parents, which I never do. And my mom's like, where are you right now? And I'm like, I'm in Japan. And my mom's like, no, you're not. And I'm like, yes, I am. She says, hold on, let me get your father. So my dad jumps on the line and he's like, where are you? I'm in Japan. He's like, I just talked to you. You were in prison and I'm leaving to go bring $10,000 of bail money to you. I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, listen, someone called and said that you had a car accident and you were a bit muffled because, you were, hurt and that I needed to bring cash to a certain area, and like your mom just thought to call you while I was heading out the door, right? So of course we called the police after this, and they said this is a well-known scam that's been going on for a very long time, and it's probably just, someone that tried to sound like you and muffling their voice, right? And so it seems that calling somebody and obfuscating the voice to trick people has been around for a very long time. So maybe just from your perspective, like, do we need a new term for like these generative AI fakes because they're somehow fundamentally different, or is this just kind of more of the same and we shouldn't really worry too much about it because we've been dealing with it for a long time?
Yeah, so it's interesting it happened to you in Japan, man, because the origin of that scam, this was like close to 8-9 years back when I was talking about voice fraud. The Japanese audience talked to me about ori ori sagi, which is help me grandma. So it's exactly that.
It's that
but
thing, wow.
At that point in time, it had started costing Japan close to $500 million in people losing their life savings to this scam. What's changed is the scale and the ability to actually mimic your voice. The fact is that now you have so many tools that anyone can do it super easily. Two, before, if you had some sort of an accent and things like that, they couldn't quite mimic your real voice. But now, because it's 15 seconds, your grandson could have a 15-second TikTok video, and that's all that's required. Not even 15 seconds. With 5 seconds, and if depending upon the demographic, you can get a pretty good clone. So what's changed is the ability to scale this. And then these fraudsters are combining these systems, these text-to-speech systems, with LLM models. So now you have a system that you're saying, okay, when the person says something, give me respond back in a particular way crafted by the LLM. And here is the crazy thing, right? Like in LLMs, hallucination is a problem. So the fact that you're making shit up is a bad idea.
Yeah.
But if you have to make shit up to convince someone, the LLM is great at doing
Perfect.
that.
That's right.
Yeah, and it's crazy. We see fraud where the LLM is coming up with crazy ways to convince you that something bad is happening.
You probably are the world's expert on voice fraud. You've probably seen more types of voice fraud than, any single person on the planet. So I'm just wondering if you could, like, we know of the ori ori sagi, which is basically what I got hit with. Can you maybe talk through some other kind of use cases for or uses of deepfakes that are prevalent today?
Deepfakes right now, you can see, right, in the political spectrum, they're there, right? Like, so election misinformation with President Biden's campaign happened. We were the ones who caught it and identified it and things like that.
What was the specifics? Are you allowed to talk about it?
Yeah, no, for sure, right? So what happened is early on this year, and, if you think about deepfakes, they affect 3 big areas: commerce, media, and communication, right? And so this is news media, social media. So what happened is at the beginning of an election year, you had the first case of election interference with everyone during the Republican primary in New Hampshire got a phone call that said,
"What a bunch of malarkey. We know the value of voting Democratic when our votes count. It's important that you save your vote for the November election."
And this was made in the voice of the president of the free world, right? President Biden, right? Like, that's the craziness. They went for the highest profile target. That came out, and, and people were like, okay, is this really President Biden? So not only did we come in and say this was a deep fake, but we identified we have something called source tracing, which tells us which AI application was used to create this deep fake. So we identified the deep fake, and then we worked with that AI application. They're an incredible company. We worked with them, and they immediately found the person who used that script and shut them down. So they couldn't create any other problem. And then later on, regulation kicked in, and they fined the telco providers who distributed these calls. They fined the political analyst who intentionally created these deep fakes. But that was, the first case of, political misinformation. You see this a lot.
Was
right
that this
now.
year?
Yeah, it was this year. It was in January of this year.
That's amazing. Okay,
Yeah.
we've got politics. We've got bilking old people.
Yeah.
Maybe one more good anecdote before we get into, whether we can detect these things.
The one thing that's really close home is in commerce, right? Like financial institutions. Generative AI came out in 2022. In 2023, we were seeing essentially one deepfake a month in some customer, right? So it was just one deepfake a month and some customer would face it. It wasn't a widespread problem. But this year, we've now seen one deepfake per customer per day. So it has rapidly exploded. And we have certain customers like really big banks who are getting a deepfake every 3 hours. Like it's insane the speed with it. So there has been a 1400% increase in the amount of deepfakes we've seen this year in the first 6 months compared to all of last year. And the year is not even over.
Can you talk to like whether these things are detectable at all? Like, is this, is this the beginning of the end, or where are we?
Martin, you've lived through many such cycles where initially it feels like the sky is falling. Online fraud, email spam, there's a whole bunch of them. But the situation is the same. They're completely detectable. Right now, we're detecting them with 99% detection rate with a 1% false positive rate. So extremely high accuracy on being able to detect them.
Just to put this in context, what are numbers for like detecting, like identifying voice? Not fraud, just like whether it's my voice.
So it's roughly about 1 in every 100,000 to 1 in every million, right? Like that's the ratio. It's much higher precision for sure, and much higher specificity. But yeah, the deepfakes you're detecting with a 99% accuracy, because when you think about even something like voice, you have 8,000 samples of your voice every single second, even in the lowest fidelity channel, which is the contact center. And so you can actually see how the voice changes over time, 8,000 times a second. And what we find is these deepfake systems, either on the frequency domain, so spectrally, or on the time domain, make mistakes. And they make a lot of mistakes. And the reason they make mistakes, and still it's very clear, is because think about it. Your human ear can't look at anomalies 8,000 times a second. If it did, you'd go mad, right? Like you'd have some serious problems. So that's the reason it's beautiful to your ear. You think it's Martin speaking on the other end, but that's where you can use good AI, which can actually look at things 8,000 times a second. Or in this, like when we're doing most online conferencing, like this podcast, it's usually 16,000. So then you have 16,000 samples of your voice. And if you're doing music, you have 44,000 samples of the musician's voice every single second. So there's so much data and so many anomalies that you can actually detect these pretty comfortably.
I see a lot of proposals, particularly from policy circles, of using things like watermarking or cryptography, which has always seemed kind of a strange idea to me, because you're kind of asking criminals to comply by something, or, and so I'm, so I don't know. How do you view more active measures to like self-identify either legit or illegitimate traffic?
Yeah, see, this is why you're in security, Martin. Almost immediately you realize that most attackers will not comply to you putting in a watermark. But even without putting in a watermark, right? Like even if you didn't have an active adversary, like the President Biden robocall that I referenced before, when it finally showed up, the system that actually generated it had a watermark in it. But when they tested it against that watermark, they only were able to extract 2%.
Oh, interesting. So you mean the original Biden call had
a watermark because it was generated by an AI app that included a watermark.
And then they copied.
And 98% of that watermark went away, largely because when you take that audio, play it across air, play it across telephony channels, they're bits and bytes, they get stripped away. And so once they get stripped away, and audio is a very sparse channel. So even if you add it over and over again, it's not possible to do it. So these watermarking techniques I mean, they're a great technique. You always think about defense in depth, where they're present. You will be able to identify a whole lot more genuine stuff with as a result of these watermarks. But attackers are not going to comply it. When you get videos like, we are now working with news media organizations, and 90% of the videos and audios they get from, for example, the Israel-Hamas war are fake. So
How many?
90% of them are fake.
What?
Yeah,
Wow. I guess I shouldn't be so surprised, but
Yeah, they're all made up. They're a different war. Some of them are cheap fakes. Some of them are actually deep fakes. Some of them are clutched together stuff. And so being able to identify what is real is going to become really important, especially because now you can do all of these things at scale.
Can you draw out how the maturation in AI technology impacts this? Because clearly something happened in the last year to make this economic for attackers, which we're seeing a rise. And clearly it's going to keep getting better.
Yeah, so one of the things that we talk about is any deepfake system should have strong resilience built in it. So it should not just be good about detecting deepfakes right now, it should be able to detect what we call zero-day deepfakes. A new system gets created, how do you detect that deepfake? And there is essentially the mental model is the following. One, deepfake architectures are not simple monolithic systems. They have like several components within them. And what ends up happening is each of these components tend to leave behind artifacts. We call this a fake print. So they all leave behind things that they do poorly, right? And so when you actually create a new system, you often find they've pulled together pieces of other systems and those leave behind their older fake prints. And so you can actually detect newer systems because they usually only improvise on one component. The second is we actually run GANs. So you get these GANs to compete. Like we create our own deepfake detection system. Now we say, how do you beat that? And we have multiple iterations of them running and we're constantly running them.
Oh, wait. I just want to make sure that I understand here.
Please.
So you're creating your own deepfake system using the approach you talked about before, which is these general adversarial networks. So then you can create a good deepfake, and then you can create a detection for that. Is that right?
Exactly. And then you beat that detection system and you run that iteration. And then what you find is actually something really interesting, which is if a deepfake system has to serve two masters, that is, one, I need to make the speech legible and sound as much like Martine. And two, I need to deceive a deepfake detection system, those two objective functions start diverging. So for example, I could start adding noise, and noise is a great way to avoid you from understanding my limitations. But if I start adding too much noise, it stops. I can't hear it. So for example, we were called into one of these deepfakes where LeBron James apparently was saying bad things about the coach during the Paris Olympics. It wasn't LeBron James, it was a deep fake. We actually provided his management team the necessary detail so that in X, it could be labeled as AI generated content. But if you look at the audio, there was a lot of noise introduced into it, right? To try and avoid detection. Lots of people couldn't even hear the audio. They were like, is this really? And so that's where you start seeing these systems diverge. And this is where I have confidence in our ability to detect it, right? Like, which is you run these GANs, you know the architectures that these deepfake generation systems are created, and ultimately you start seeing divergences in one of the objective functions. So either you as a human will be able to detect something's off, or we as a system will be able to detect something's off.
I mean, one of the reasons that spam works and deepfakes work is just the marginal cost of the next call is so low that you can do these things in mass, right? Like the marginal cost of the next spam email or whatever. If it takes me a dollar to generate N deepfakes, how much does it cost to detect N deepfakes? Is it 1 to 1? Is it 10 to 1? Is it 100 to 1?
Yeah. it's way cheaper to detect deepfakes, right? Because if you think about it, the closest example is Apple released its model, that could run on device. And even that model, which is a small model, in order to do lots of things like voice to text and things like that, our model is about 100 times smaller than that. So it's so much faster in detecting deepfakes. So the ratio is about 1/100th right now, and we're constantly figuring out ways to make it even cheaper, but it's 1/100th that of generation.
Wow, I see. So to detect it is 2 orders of magnitude cheaper than creation, which
Yes.
means in order for anybody to, to economically get, listen, if there is no defense, there's no defense. But if there is a defense, it requires the bad guys to have, 2 orders of magnitude more resources, which
Yeah.
is actually pretty dramatic, given normally you go for parity on these things because there tends to be a lot more good people than bad people.
Yeah.
So,
And that's the thing. You have 2 orders of magnitude. And then the fact is that once you know what a deepfake looks like, unless they re-architect the entire system, and the only companies that re-architect full pipelines, and the last time this was done is back when Google released Tacotron, where they re-architected several pieces of the pipeline. It's a very expensive proposition.
is the intuitive reason that the cost is so much cheaper to detect is this you just have to do less stuff? Like the person generated the deepfake has to sound like a human, be passable to a human, and evade this. And so that's just more things than detecting it, which just can be a much more narrow focus. So it'll always be cheaper to detect. And then you don't see a period in time where the AI is so good no deepfake mechanism can detect it. You don't see that.
We don't see that, because either you become so good at avoiding detection that you actually start becoming worse at producing human-generated speech, or you're producing human-generated speech, and unless you actually create a physical representation of a human, because we've had 10,000 years of evolution, and the way we produce speech has vocal cords, has the diaphragm, has your lips and your mouth and your nasal cavity, all of that physical attributes. It's really hard for these systems to replicate all of that. They have generic models, and those generic models are good. You can also think about the more we learn about your voice, Martin, the better we can get at knowing where your voice is deviating.
And I have an incentive as a good guy to work with you on that, right? So you'll have access to data where the bad people may not have access to data, and it totally makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So it seems to me almost like the spam lessons learned apply here, which is spam can be very effective for attackers, very effective. Defenses can also be incredibly effective. However, you have to put them in place. And so is it the same situation here, which is be sure you have a strategy for deepfake detection, but if you do, you'll be okay.
That's exactly right. And I think, it has to be in each of the areas, right? Like when you think about deepfakes, you have incredible AI applications that are doing wonderful things in each of these spaces. Like, the voice cloning apps, they've actually given voices to people who have throat cancer and things like that, right? Yeah. But in each of those situations, it was with the consent of the user who wanted their voice recreated, right? And so that notion that the source AI applications need to make sure that the people using their platform actually are the people who want to use their platform. That's part A.
And this is where the partnerships that you talked about with the actual generation companies comes in, so that you can help them for the legitimate use cases as well as sniffing out the illegitimate one. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. 11 labs, incredible. The amount of work they're doing to create voices ethically and safely and carefully is incredible. They're trying to get lots of great tools out there. We're partnering with them. They're making their data sets accessible to us. There are companies like that, right? There's another company called Respeecher that did a lot of the Hollywood movies. So all of these companies are starting to partner in order to be able to do this in the right way. And it's similar to, a lot of what happened in the, fraud situation back in the 2000s or the email spam situation back in the 2000s.
I want to shift over to policy. So I've been in a lot of policy discussions lately, in the California in California as well as at the federal level. And so have you given thought to what guidance you would give to policymakers, many of who listen to this podcast, and how they should think about any regulations or rules around this, and maybe how it intersects with things like innovation and free speech, et cetera? I mean, it's a complicated topic.
I think the simple one-liner answer is they should make it really difficult for threat actors and really flexible for creators, right? Like that's the ultimate difference. And so, and history is rife with a lot of great ways, right? Like you lived through the email days where the CAN-SPAM Act was a great way, but it came in combination with better ML technologies, right?
Maybe just walk through how CAN-SPAM works. I think it's a good analog.
The CAN-SPAM Act is one where, anyone who's providing unsolicited marketing has to be clear on its headers, has to allow you to opt out, all of those things. And if you don't follow this very strict set of policies, you can be fined. And you also have great detection technologies that allow you to detect these spams, right? Like now that you follow a particular standard, especially when you're doing unsolicited marketing or you're trying to do, bad things like pornography or things like that, you have detection AI/ML technologies that can detect you well. The same thing happened when when banks went online, right? Like you had a lot of online fraud, or e-commerce, right? You had a lot of online fraud. And if you remember, the Know Your Customer Act and the Anti-Money Laundering Acts came in there. So the onus was you as a organization have to know your customer. You have to put in technology that knows your customer. That's the guarantee. And so you need technology. After that, you can do what you want. And so I think what was really good about both of those cases is they got really specific on one, what can the technology detect? Because if the technology can't detect it, you can't litigate, you can't find the people who are misusing it and so on. So what can the technology detect? And two, how do I make it really specific on what you can and cannot do in order to be able to do this? And so I think those two were great examples of how we should think about litigation. And in deepfake, there is this very clear thing, right? Like you have free speech, but for the longest time, anytime you used free speech for fraud, or you were trying to incite violence, or you were trying to do obscene things, these are clear places where the free speech guarantees go away. So as long as you're not doing that, right? Like I think if you're doing that, you should be fined, right? And you should have laws that protect you against that. And that's the model I like to think of.
But then there's this kind of gray area of unwanted stuff, right? And the unwanted stuff is like, you didn't ask for it. It may not be illegal, but it's super annoying and it's unwanted, and it can fill your inbox and it can fill your whatever. And for those, you can put in rules, because if somebody crosses those rules, you can litigate them or you can opt out of it. And so it kind of regulates the unwanted. I could see that definitely happening here. And then, of course, there's the wanted stuff, which, doesn't require any regulation.
And the only other thing that I'll say is right now, because we consume things through a lot of platforms should be held accountable at some level to, clearly demarcating what is real and what is not, right? Because otherwise it's going to be really hard for the average consumer to know that this is AI generated versus this is not. So I think, there's a certain amount of accountability there.
Because the technology is where it is, putting on the onus on the platforms to do best practices, just like we did for spam, right? Like I rely on Microsoft and Google for the spam detection, doing the same type of thing for the platform. It sounds like a very, very sensible recommendation. Yeah. So key point number one is, deepfakes have been around for a long time. We probably need a new name for this new generation. And this isn't just like some hypothetical thing, but you're seeing a massive increase. You said as much as one per day. And the cost to generate has gone way down. Yep. Good news is that these things are imminently detectable, and in your opinion will always be detectable if you have a solution in place.
Yep.
And then as a result, I think, any policy should provide the guidance and maybe accountability for the platforms to detect it, because we can actually detect it. And so listen, it's something for people to know about. but it's not the end of the world, and policymakers don't have to regulate all of AI for this one specific use case. Is this a fair synopsis?
This is a beautiful synopsis, Martin. You've captured it really, really well.
Thank you so much for listening to the A16Z podcast. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe so that you are the first to get our exclusive video content. Or you can check out this video that we've hand-selected for you.